So who's running this thing anyway? Welcome back to our ongoing course on safe-ish protesting. As a reminder from last week, we covered that we don't think that there's any such thing as safe protesting because it isn't up to the protesters that a protest remain safe. It's up to people in power, and it's up to counter-agents who may oppose the protest message. You can do everything right as a protester and still be in an unsafe environment. So we recommend that you engage in safe-ish protesting in a risk-aware and informed manner. Like I said last week, you can find all of this course for free publicly on our Patreon at patreon.com/Sanctum of the Craft. You can find it there as a recording of a live seminar that we taught here in North Carolina at a mutual aid center, or you can find it in a downloadable booklet form, PDF, EPUB, etc., whichever you prefer to download. If you need the information in a hurry, I would recommend that you find it there because I'm posting these about once a week and it's going to be a little while before I get through the entirety of the information. But back to the topic that we're covering today, organizational structures. Who's running this protest anyway? The assumption of this class is that you are a person who is attending a protest rather than one of the people organizing the protest. We have a separate class series for how to organize a protest, and it covers vitally different information than this class series and the accompanying booklet that I already told you where you can find. There are different kinds of protests organized by different groups of people. A protest can start with a single person in a signal group, a labor union, a civic advocacy group, the members of a community center, a political party office, or even spontaneously. It is our recommendation that, with the exception of a spontaneous protest, some effort be made to vet the person or persons responsible for organizing the protest. A person protesting should not show up and immediately feel as though they have the right to take over or to take charge of the protest. However, that does not strip them of their individual right to express themselves, leave if they do not feel comfortable, or to take care of themselves or others. For example, if the protest organizers have not provided water, an individual protester could start passing out water bottles if they felt moved to do so. A special note for medics: if you are the person who is running the protest, then you are not the person who is the medic for that protest. These need to be separate roles. However, the medic is always in charge of the medic spaces. If there is a medic collective that is setting up a clinic or a response station or a medic tent, the medic who is in charge of that space is not in charge of the protest, the action, the event, the response, etc., but they are in charge of the medic space. However, if they are in charge of the medic space, they are not generally the medic who's providing active medic care. Those also need to be separate roles, but that is something to discuss in our ongoing class series on becoming a street medic. Let's talk about various organizational structures, specifically collectives and affinity groups. An affinity group is the basic social structure of protest politics, the concept of which developed out of 19th century anarchism. An affinity group is a group formed around a shared interest, an affinity, to which individuals formally or informally belong. An affinity group can be anything from a knitting circle to a group engaged in political activism. They tend to be based around a common social identity or ideology, a shared concern, a shared interest or skill, a shared activity, a shared community role, or shared personal identity. There is some confusion of terminology because the term collective also refers to a group of individuals coming together, but rather than having a shared affinity, they have a shared goal, sometimes with a focus on social, political, or economic issues. They engage in collective action. So, for example, an affinity group can be a group of people who all get together because they love D&D, right? That can be an affinity group. Whereas a collective is a group of people who all get together because they want to oppose one specific political action that is occurring in their community, and it could be made up of people who absolutely love D&D as well as people who absolutely hate D&D. They don't gather because of their shared affinity, they gather because of their shared goal of opposing that specific political action. Now, it's not always a political action that draws a group together as a collective. It could be anything from cleaning up a river to handing out food to providing medical support to a protest. An affinity group has a shared interest or ideology. A collective has a shared goal. Collectives often form out of affinity groups, but not always. There is also absolutely a Venn diagram of overlap where groups fit into both terms but choose which they prefer to go by. A medic collective is a group of riot, street, action, or protest medics who provide training and work together. A note on terminology. Some groups may choose to call themselves street medic collectives or riot medic collectives. Other groups that are not medics use the term collective to refer to their organizing structure. For the purpose of this class, we will use collectives to refer to groups that have a specific goal, and medic collectives to refer to any of the riot, street, protest, or action medic collective groups, and affinity groups to differentiate the social structure that drew the group together in the first place. Some medic collectives work under the umbrella of an affinity group, but many do not. Medic collectives often maintain that it is necessary for them to have autonomy from the groups that form the coalitions of activists and protesters. In the recent history of street medicine, it has been common to teach that the medic collectives have been so neutral as to provide assistance as medics at protests for things they do not support, such as neo-Nazi protests. In some regions of the US, this is no longer practical as street medics have been targeted first by police during actions. It's important to know the context in your local area. I'm going to call out right now that I am what is referred to as a black street medic. A black street medic is one who does not consider themselves neutral. I do not consider myself neutral. I will not help neo-Nazis with my very limited and quite expensive supplies. However, that does not mean that I do not support street medics who make a different choice than I do. In fact, in many cases, I believe that they are doing better things than I am, but there are limits to what I can get myself to do and lines that I can get myself to cross. So, moving on. An affinity collective or affinity medic has a primary responsibility to their group and not to the protest as a whole. Affinity groups can also contain affinity groups. So for example, if you belong to a large affinity group for a social cause, it may contain smaller local groups, and within those groups, smaller affinity groups of 4 to 16 people that tend to work together. So why work with an affinity group? They provide support before, during, and after actions. They can pool supplies and resources. They can share skills, a couple of medics, some legal observers, various scouts, supply runners, lookouts, etc. They can provide arrest and jail support, and there may be reduced infiltration, although importantly, that isn't the same as no infiltration. In mobilizations for large-scale events where there are many groups participating, affinity groups and medic collective members may form a cluster or a group of affinity groups. For example, if a situation is logistically complex, involving emergency care, client intent care, wellness care, decontamination, response to traumatic situations, etc., clusters may form in areas where people are mobilizing and working together. Your cluster would be who you're working with, and the collective or affinity group is who you would debrief to. Sometimes these clusters are referred to as teams. Why to maybe not work with an affinity group? You are essentially giving up part of your decision-making power as to what type of support you will provide, when, to whom, and how. If joining an affinity group, you may be okay with that. There's increased surface area for potential social networking attacks. The demands of community building can distract from the interest that brought you all together in the first place. There is the potential to be asked to provide an unrealistic level of support if the people making decisions aren't familiar with your capabilities and your limitations. There are potential recognition problems, and thus targeting by state actors and/or counter-agents may be an issue. And organizational activities and meetings can be a pretty heavy time and energy commitment. What about as part of a collective? Working with an existing collective or creating a new one has many advantages compared to working alone. Why work with a collective? There's skill sharing and the pooling of experience. There's resource sharing. Working with a group means that you know that someone else will show up if you can't. There's support before, during, and after protests. There's a potential to formalize and register as a nonprofit organization, which carries its own risks. And even without the legal status of a nonprofit, a named, recognized collective may get more support from the local community, which again, also has some element of risk. The larger the collective, the more formalized and structured it should be. Someone in the group with a specialized background should be appointed to teach others and share skills and experience. Someone in the group should be appointed to manage stores and resources. Someone in the group should be appointed to info and OPSEC, etc. Why to maybe not join a collective? There's recognition and thus targeting by state power, recognition and thus targeting by counteragents. There's a potential for moral objection to certain causes that they will end up providing support for. For example, there have been meta-collectives who have provided support for causes that I would not support. I would have to leave that collective because I would not be willing to do that. Demands of community building and internal conflict resolution can distract from accomplishing any goals. Practices, walkthroughs, and organizational meetings can be a heavy time and energy commitment, and you are absolutely giving up part of your decision-making power as to what type of support you will provide, when, how, and to whom. It is also possible to partner up for larger actions in a cluster, team, or working group, which tends to be made up of individuals who are working solo, belong to collectives, and/or belong to affinity groups, who are choosing to work together for the course of a single action. This allows them to benefit from their varying skill levels, experience, tactics, and abilities, and to pool their resources. A general protester or medic may end up in a working group in the block, at a medic station, at a clinic, at a water and snack station, mobile through an action at a decontamination area, etc. Before going out to an action, it is wise to check in with anyone you know in the area to see if working groups are in need of someone with your skill set, if you're not already working with a collective or affinity group. Which brings me to the risk or needs assessment. As part of preparing to work within various organizational structures, a protester should go through a risk assessment or needs assessment. At a minimum, here are some questions that a protester could ask themselves as part of that assessment. What are you preparing for? Is this a march, a set-in, a series of speeches in the park, etc.? Is this protest without a permit, blocking traffic, or taking over a government building? Does your presence support the cause of the action? Do you understand the topic and the purpose of the action? Are you qualified for the role that you are stepping into? How many people are expected to be there? Are you prepared for that? There's a pretty big difference between a protest of 50 people and 5,000 people. Will you be working with someone else? Will you be joining with an affinity group, a collective? Will you be pairing up with a buddy? Will you be working in a team? Do you and the others that you are potentially working with have all the materials you need? And do you have plans in place for when things inevitably go wrong? Okay, next time we are going to pick up on the buddy pair and why to work with a buddy and why not to work with a buddy. I personally do work with a buddy now. But for many, many years, I was fiercely independent. I'm sure that that's a shock to everyone who's familiar with our channel, that I would be fiercely independent. But I do work with a buddy now, and I have to say, because I have a competent buddy who can keep up with me both physically and intellectually, and who's great at carrying stuff and reminding me to, eat and drink, it's great. But we'll get into the pros and cons of working with a buddy next time. But for now, what's an affinity group that you probably belong to without having recognized that you belong to an affinity group? Is there a group of people that you meet up with because you're all into local theater? Do you always gather with a specific group of friends to watch films? Or maybe you're part of a D&D group. Or maybe you go to your local LGBTQIA center and you're part of the bigger affinity group of the people who identify as part of the LGBTQIA community in your area. Do you belong to an affinity group? Do you know what affinity group that is? And as you're trying to build community and potentially find people to go to actions with, it may turn out that you already belong to an affinity group that is engaging in collective action in your area. And if you do belong to an affinity group that's engaging in collective action, it may be that there's a role that you could step into that works with your specific boundaries, limitations, and capabilities. So think about it for a bit. Please remember to like, subscribe, and potentially share our content with people you feel would benefit from it. Be safe out there, everyone.